The catalyst for the transatlantic slave trade was indeed the rebuilding of the revived Roman Empire. The transatlantic slave trade was a continuation of the targeting of the Black Hebrew Israelites, who were already vulnerable due to their history of persecution and enslavement under the Roman Empire. The Romans had previously targeted Black Hebrew Israelites for enslavement and persecution. This historical precedent set the stage for later European powers to continue this pattern of oppression. During the transatlantic slave trade, European powers, often fueled by anti-Semitic and anti-black sentiment, specifically targeted Black Hebrew Israelites above all other dark-skinned groups. This was not only driven by economic interest, but also by a desire to suppress and erase the cultural, spiritual, and historical identities of the biblical ancient Israelites. Furthermore, it is also very important to note that during the transatlantic slave trade, it was Black Africans selling Hebrew Israelites who were a very distinct ethnic group who had migrated to many places in Western and Sub-Saharan Africa. Distinct African tribes were selling Hebrews to Europeans, not Africans selling their own people to Europeans. This is a very common misconception. After the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem around 63 CE, many Black Hebrew Israelites migrated to West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas, where they established communities and maintained their cultural and religious practices. The Romans, aware of the presence of these communities, intentionally traveled to West Africa and Sub-Saharan regions to capture and enslave Black Hebrew Israelites. This was a deliberate effort to exploit their labor, culture, and resources. Roman records, such as those of the historian Strabo, who lived from 63 BCE to 24 CE, mention the presence of Jewish communities in West Africa. Strabo writes in his book Geography, Book 17, Chapter 3, Section 23, the Hebrews, who are also called Ethiopians, inhabit the western parts of Africa, near the Atlantic coast. Other Roman sources, like the writings of the Roman philosopher Seneca, who lived from 4 BCE to 65 CE, also reference the enslavement of Black Hebrew Israelites who settled in Africa, including those from the region where Black Hebrew Israelites settled. Seneca writes in his book De Superstitione, "The worst superstition is to believe in the bondage of the soul, as the Hebrews do, who think the souls of those who've been conquered are also conquered. The Hebrews who have settled in Africa are enslaved." Archaeological findings in West Africa, particularly in modern-day Mali, Ghana, and Senegal, confirm the presence of ancient Jewish communities. Ancient Hebrew inscriptions and artifacts have been found in the Telem caves in Mali, dating back to the 11th century BCE. Excavations have uncovered evidence of ancient Hebrew presence, including a synagogue and Hebrew inscriptions in Mali at the border of Mauritania at the Kumbi Saleh archaeological site. The Senegambian stone circles found in Senegal and the Gambia bear similarities to the stone circles mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Excavations have uncovered artifacts such as Hebrew inscriptions, ritual objects, and synagogue remains dating back to the 1st century CE. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And the intentional enslavement of Black Hebrew Israelites by the Romans contributed to the displacement, cultural erasure, and marginalization of these communities from antiquity to our modern era. This painful legacy continues to impact the descendants of these communities today, who are still fighting for peace, recognition, justice, and equality. The Romans played a significant role in the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, particularly during the Roman Empire, which lasted from 27 BC to 476 AD. They established trade routes and networks across the Mediterranean, which included the exchange of slaves from Sub-Saharan Africa. Roman merchants and traders would often travel to West Africa, where they would purchase slaves from local rulers and merchants. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade routes connected West Africa to the Mediterranean region, spanning over 4,000 miles. Slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, often under harsh conditions, to reach the Mediterranean ports. The main routes went from modern-day Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia to Italy, Spain and other parts of Europe. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment. The Roman Empire had a high demand for slaves, particularly for agricultural labor, domestic work and entertainment, like gladiators. Slaves from Black Hebrew Israelites were prized for their strength, skills and, their exotic appearance. Roman slave owners often subjected slaves to harsh treatment, including physical punishment, forced labor and sexual exploitation. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade had a devastating impact on Black Hebrew Israelite societies, leading to depopulation and disruption of communities, economic instability and exploitation, and cultural exchange and influence, which could be both positive and negative. The Romans wanted the Black Hebrew Israelites for several reasons. First, economic value. Black Hebrew Israelites were skilled in various trades, such as agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce. They were also familiar with the Trans-Saharan trade routes, making them valuable assets for Roman economic interests. Second, cultural and religious significance. Black Hebrew Israelites possessed ancient knowledge, cultural practices, and religious traditions that the Romans sought to exploit and assimilate into their own culture. Third, military strength. Black Hebrew Israelites were known for their military prowess, which the Romans wanted to harness for their own imperial ambitions. Fourth, genetic diversity. The Romans sought to diversify their own population by incorporating the genetic material of Black Hebrew Israelites, who were seen as exotic and valuable for their distinct physical characteristics. Fifth, symbolic dominance. By enslaving Black Hebrew Israelites, the Romans aimed to assert their dominance over a people who had maintained their cultural and religious identity despite centuries of colonization and oppression. And lastly, fear of their prophetic traditions. The Romans may have seen the Black Hebrew Israelites' prophetic traditions and messianic expectations as a threat to their own power and authority. The Romans' desire to enslave Black Hebrew Israelites was driven by a combination of economic, cultural, military, genetic, symbolic, and political factors. They traveled far to capture and enslave them because they saw immense value in their skills, knowledge, and cultural heritage.
Genetic research and historical records suggest that the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, targeting Black Hebrew Israelites, began around the 1st century CE during the reign of Emperor Augustus from 27 BCE to 14 CE. Timeline. In 40 CE, Yahawashi, or Jesus, was crucified. Between 40 and 60 CE, the persecution of Yahawashi's followers, including Black Hebrew Israelites, intensified. In 63 CE, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem led to many Black Hebrew Israelites being exiled, displaced, murdered, or forced into slavery. From 60 to 100 CE, the Roman Empire expanded into West Africa, establishing trade routes and networks. Between 100 and 300 CE, the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade escalated, with Black Hebrew Israelites being targeted for their skills, culture, and religious practices. Roman Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 CE, issued an edict in 41 CE expelling all Hebrews from Rome. This edict may have marked the beginning of targeted persecution and enslavement of Black Hebrew Israelites. Like, share, subscribe and comment. Roman Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 CE, launched a campaign against all Hebrews and Black Hebrews who followed the Way or Christ's teachings. This campaign may have led to increased enslavement and forced migration of Black Hebrew Israelites across the Sahara. Keep in mind that the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade was a complex, centuries-long phenomenon with various empires and powers involved. The Romans played a significant role, but they weren't the only ones. It was the confederacy of many nations against the Black Hebrew Israelites that contributed to the maintenance of the practice. just as in the Transatlantic Slave Trade. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade laid the groundwork for the Transatlantic Slave Trade, spanning from the 15th to the 19th centuries. Edomite powers like Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish merchants, among others, exploited existing slave trade networks, including those established by the Romans. Millions of Black Hebrew Israelites were forcibly enslaved, brutalized, and transported to and from the Americas. It is also important to note that the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish merchants are not descendants of the biblical Jewish people or the ancient Israelites. The legacy of slavery, colonization, and persecution continues to impact Black Hebrew Israelites today. Systemic racism, discrimination, and marginalization persist in areas like education, employment, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice. The erasure of their history, culture, and identity has contributed to their ongoing oppression. Confederate hands, various powers and interests have conspired against Black Hebrew Israelites throughout history. This includes ancient empires, European colonizers, Jewish slave traders, and modern-day systems of oppression. Their struggle for recognition, justice, and equality continues. Modern-day marginalization. Black Hebrew Israelites face unique challenges, including lack of recognition as a distinct ethnic and religious group, erasure of their history and cultural heritage, discrimination and bias in areas like education and employment, and limited access to resources, opportunities, and social services.
The Sub-Saharan Slave Trade, which predates the Transatlantic Slave Trade, was a network of slave trading routes across Africa, fueled by demand from the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa. The Romans played a significant role in this trade, particularly during the Roman Empire, from 27 BCE to 476 CE. The Romans' involvement in the slave trade helped lay the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade in several ways. Roman trade networks and routes, such as the Sahara Desert trade routes, were later used by European powers to transport enslaved Africans to the Americas. Roman demand for slaves helped create a culture of slavery in Africa, which was later exploited by European powers. Roman ports, markets, and trading posts were adapted by later European powers for the transatlantic slave trade. The sub-Saharan slave trade continued after the Roman Empire's decline, with various Arab clans, African empires, and European powers participating. The revival of the Roman Empire and the Portuguese, in particular, played a significant role in establishing the transatlantic slave trade, using their knowledge of African trade routes and ports to transport millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Key factors that connected the sub-Saharan slave trade to the transatlantic slave trade include the revival of the Roman Empire via European powers, especially Portugal, Spain, and later Britain and France, along with the Edomite Jews and others. The establishment of colonies in the Americas created a demand for labor. Advances in maritime technology enabled transatlantic voyages. Europeans built upgraded maritime technology based on earlier designs from Africans, and the development of the triangular trade linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European powers like Portugal and the Netherlands encountered African maritime traditions during their explorations. They incorporated these influences into their own shipbuilding designs, leading to further innovations. The Romans' influence on the transatlantic slave trade and the targeting of Black Hebrew Israelites is a complex and multifaceted topic. The Romans had a vast slave trade network which included enslaved Hebrews. This legacy of slavery was inherited by European powers who adapted and expanded it during the transatlantic slave trade. During the Roman Empire, Black Hebrew Israelites were identified and targeted for persecution, forced conversion, or enslavement. This identification and targeting continued during the transatlantic slave trade. Roman laws, such as the Justinian Code, were used to justify and regulate slavery. These laws were later adopted and adapted by European powers to legitimize the transatlantic slave trade. The Romans' adoption of Christianity led to the spread of the Curse of Ham narrative, which was used to justify the enslavement of black people, especially the Hebrew Israelites. The Roman slave trade networks in the Mediterranean were connected to the Atlantic slave trade, allowing for the transportation of enslaved Africans, including Black Hebrew Israelites, to the Americas. It's essential to note that the transatlantic slave trade was a distinct historical event, separate from the Roman Empire's slave trade. However, the Romans' legacy of slavery, laws, and targeting of the Hebrew Israelites contributed to the development of the transatlantic slave trade and the targeting of black people, including and especially the Black Hebrew Israelites. In conclusion, the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, fueled by the Roman Empire's demand for slaves, laid the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade. The intentional targeting of Black Hebrew Israelites by the Romans, followed by European powers, has had a lasting impact on their communities. The legacy of slavery, colonization, and persecution continues to affect Black Hebrew Israelites today, with ongoing struggles for recognition, justice, and equality. It is essential to acknowledge and confront this painful history, recognizing the complex web of factors that contributed to the enslavement and marginalization of Black Hebrew Israelites. By understanding this history, we can work towards a more equitable future, addressing the systemic racism and discrimination that persists in our societies. For the Most High God, Yahweh, will have mercy on Jacob and will choose the Hebrew Israelites and settle them in their own land. The strangers will be joined with them, and they will cling to the house of Jacob. Then people will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them for servants and handmaids in the land of the Most High God, Yahweh. They will take them captive whose captives they were, and rule over their oppressors. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe.